They prepared for an invasion that would never come. In the winter of 1945, Japan fortified every beach, armed every civilian, and embraced death as a final strategy. Generals promised the emperor that invading forces would drown in their own blood. But while they stacked ammunition along coastlines and trained children to charge tanks with bamboo spears, something far quieter was already destroying them. Not fire, not steel, hunger. The war would not end in a blaze of kamikaze glory or a million corpses defending sacred soil. It would end in silence, empty harbors, dark factories, and the slow realization that an empire cannot survive when it cannot eat. The Japanese Empire in early 1945 resembled a vast organism whose circulatory system had begun to fail. Every artery of commerce, every vein of supply, depended entirely on ships crossing open water. Japan possessed no oil beneath its soil, no rubber plantations on its islands, no iron ore in sufficient quantity to sustain even a fraction of its industrial machinery. It imported everything: rice from Korea and Taiwan, coal from Manchuria, petroleum from the South Pacific territories it had seized in desperation, metals from China. Even the basic foodstuffs that kept its cities from starvation arrived by sea, transported across thousands of miles by merchant vessels that had become the invisible foundation of national survival. The merchant marine was not glamorous. These ships did not fire guns or launch aircraft. They simply moved cargo. Day after day, they crossed hostile waters carrying the unglamorous materials of existence: bags of grain, barrels of fuel, crates of machinery parts. But in the mathematics of total war, they mattered more than battleships. A navy could win tactical victories and still lose the war if there was no fuel to power the next sortie, no ammunition to reload the guns, no food to keep the sailors alive. Japan understood this, but only intellectually. Its military culture worshipped offensive spirit and glorified sacrifice. The idea that the empire might collapse not from weakness of will, but from simple logistical mathematics seemed incomprehensible, unworthy of consideration. Yet by the beginning of 1945, that collapse was already underway. American submarines had spent 3 years systematically hunting Japanese cargo vessels, sending them to the bottom with ruthless efficiency. The merchant fleet had been decimated. What remained operated under constant threat, captains navigating by night and praying their routes had not been compromised. Shipping tonnage had fallen catastrophically. Ports that once buzzed with activity now saw only sporadic arrivals. Supply chains fractured. Factories began to slow, then stop. But the true horror had not yet arrived. In Washington, military planners studied maps and tonnage reports with cold precision. They recognized what Japanese commanders refused to acknowledge. The enemy's merchant marine was wounded, vulnerable, clinging to life. One more blow, properly delivered, could sever it entirely. But how? Submarine warfare had achieved remarkable results, but submarines were expensive, took years to build, and required highly trained crews. Each boat could only attack limited targets in limited areas. The planners needed something more devastating, something scalable, something that could turn the entire sea around Japan into a death trap. The answer arrived in the form of a deceptively simple weapon: the naval mine. Not the crude contact mines of earlier wars, but sophisticated devices equipped with magnetic and acoustic sensors that could detect the presence of a ship passing overhead and detonate with precision. These weapons possessed a terrible elegance. They required no operators, no complex targeting, no elaborate logistics once deployed. A mine dropped into water would simply wait, silent and invisible, until a ship passed above it. Then it would kill. But delivering thousands of mines to Japanese waters presented its own challenges. Surface ships could not approach the enemy coastline without being destroyed. Submarines could deploy mines, but in limited quantities. The solution emerged from an unexpected source: the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. This massive bomber, designed to carry tons of explosives across vast distances, could be adapted to carry mines instead. Its range allowed it to reach any target in Japan. Its payload capacity meant each aircraft could deliver multiple weapons in a single mission, and its operational ceiling placed it beyond the reach of most Japanese defenses. The plan crystallized into what planners designated Operation Starvation. The name carried no poetry, no propaganda value. It simply described the objective with brutal honesty: not to kill soldiers, not to destroy military installations, to starve an entire nation by making the movement of food and fuel impossible. The execution began in late March of 1945. The first B-29s took off under cover of darkness, their bomb bays loaded not with incendiaries but with 1,000-pound mines. They flew over the Pacific at altitudes that turned the ocean below into an abstract pattern of darkness and reflected moonlight. Navigation required extraordinary precision. The mines had to be dropped in specific locations to maximize their effectiveness. Too scattered and ships could navigate around them. Too concentrated, and the enemy could focus sweeping efforts. The targets were chosen with surgical care. The Shimonoseki Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the inland sea to the open ocean, became a primary focus. Nearly all shipping to and from the industrial heartland of Japan passed through this chokepoint. Mining it would be equivalent to placing a tourniquet around the nation's neck. Kobe and Osaka, critical ports handling enormous volumes of cargo, received similar treatment. The mines fell through the night sky, entering the water with minimal disturbance, settling to the seafloor, activating their sensors, and beginning their silent vigil. The Japanese discovered the danger quickly but understood its implications slowly. The first ships to strike mines simply vanished. Explosions tore through hulls. Water rushed into cargo holds. Vessels sank in minutes, taking their cargoes and crews to the bottom. Survivors reported no warning, no visible threat, just sudden catastrophic destruction. Initial reports blamed submarine torpedoes, but the pattern made no sense. Ships were being destroyed in waters too shallow for submarine operations, in areas that should have been safe. When the truth became clear, it triggered a crisis that the Japanese high command was utterly unprepared to address. Mines presented a uniquely difficult problem. Unlike submarines, they could not be hunted and destroyed. Unlike surface raiders, they required no supply lines to cut. They simply existed, invisible and patient, waiting. Clearing them required specialized equipment, trained personnel, and above all, time. Time Japan did not have. The empire attempted to adapt. Minesweepers, vessels equipped with equipment designed to detonate or disable mines, were deployed in frantic efforts to reopen critical shipping lanes. But the scale of the problem overwhelmed them. The Americans were dropping mines faster than they could be cleared. Each night brought new B-29 missions, new minefields, new areas rendered impassable. The minesweepers themselves became targets. Mines destroyed them with the same cold efficiency they destroyed cargo vessels. The men aboard the sweepers understood they were being sacrificed. They went to sea anyway, because orders demanded it, because duty required it, knowing that the mathematical odds made their deaths inevitable. Shipping volumes collapsed. In the months before Operation Starvation, Japan had been moving approximately 1 million tons of cargo per month through its ports, barely enough to sustain basic functions. By May of 1945, that figure had fallen to less than 200,000 tons. The difference represented more than statistics. It represented cities without coal for power generation, factories without raw materials for production. populations without adequate food. The effects cascaded through every aspect of Japanese society with inexorable logic. Coal, essential for generating electricity and powering industrial machinery, could not be transported from mines to consumption points. Power plants ran out of fuel. Electricity generation declined. Factories that had survived American bombing raids now sat dark and silent, their machinery intact but useless. Steel mills could not operate without coal. Without steel production, weapons manufacture became impossible. Artillery pieces sat unfinished on factory floors. Aircraft existed only as partially assembled frames. Tanks could not be completed. The military machine ground to a halt not because it had been destroyed, but because it could not be fed. The civilian population faced horrors of a different kind. Rice imports from Korea and Taiwan, the difference between subsistence and starvation for millions, ceased almost entirely. Fishing fleets could not operate because their vessels could not safely leave port. Food distribution networks fractured. Urban populations, entirely dependent on transported goods, began to starve in earnest. Ration allocations, already meager, were cut again and again. Official distributions fell below 1,000 calories per day, a slow death sentence for anyone performing physical labor. Black markets emerged in every city, shadow economies where those with resources bartered for survival. A kimono might be traded for a bag of rice. Family heirlooms disappeared in exchange for vegetables. The social fabric began to tear under the pressure of hunger. People who had endured years of war, who had accepted sacrifice as patriotic duty, now faced a different calculus. Loyalty meant nothing to empty stomachs. Propaganda could not be eaten. The emperor's divine status provided no calories. In the countryside, peasants who had always existed on the edge of subsistence found themselves targets of desperate urban refugees. City dwellers, some educated and wealthy, traveled to farming villages begging for food. The reversal of social hierarchies was complete and devastating. A university professor might kneel before a farmer, offering money that meant nothing, pleading for rice that might keep his children alive another week. Yet through all of this, the Japanese military leadership remained fixated on the coming invasion. They studied maps of beaches. They calculated how many divisions could be concentrated at likely landing sites. They refined plans for kamikaze attacks that would turn every aircraft, every boat, every human being into a weapon. The idea that the war might be lost without the Americans ever setting foot on Japanese soil seemed inconceivable. Generals trained in a doctrine of offensive warfare could not comprehend defeat through absence of action, through the slow grinding pressure of logistics denied. Some officers recognized the truth. Intelligence reports documented the mining campaign with painful precision. Analysis showed shipping losses, traced the contraction of supply lines, calculated the timeline until complete economic collapse. These reports reached senior commanders and were acknowledged, then filed away. The strategic framework of the Japanese military had no mechanism to address this kind of warfare. Mines were a technical problem, something for specialists to solve. The real war would be fought on the beaches. That was where honor resided. That was where the decisive battle would occur. This cognitive dissonance between reality and doctrine created a strange paralysis. Resources that might have been directed toward massive minesweeping efforts or reorganization of internal logistics remained committed to coastal fortifications. Concrete and steel went into bunkers that would never be tested rather than into equipment that might restore shipping capacity. The empire was bleeding to death, while its defenders prepared for a different death entirely. The Americans, meanwhile, refined their campaign with methodical precision. Analysts studied Japanese shipping patterns and identified new targets. Pilots flew mission after mission, their B-29s crossing the Pacific darkness to deliver payloads of silent destruction. The cost-benefit calculation was staggering. Each mine cost approximately $1,500 to manufacture and deploy. Each ship sunk represented hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in value, plus irreplaceable cargo and trained crew. The return on investment was almost obscene. By summer, the mining campaign had effectively closed the inland sea to commercial traffic. This body of water, historically the economic heart of Japan, became a graveyard. Ships lay abandoned at docks, their captains refusing to risk the journey. Others rusted at anchor in ports that had run out of cargo to load. The scenes carried a surreal quality. Infrastructure remained intact. Cranes stood ready. Warehouses waited, but nothing moved. The machinery of commerce had stopped, paralyzed by invisible threat. Desperate measures followed. The Japanese attempted to shift to smaller vessels, boats that might pass over mines without triggering magnetic or acoustic sensors. Some success was achieved, but the tonnage carried by small boats could not replace the cargo capacity of proper merchant ships. It was the equivalent of trying to fill a reservoir with a teaspoon. Mathematically possible in theory, practically absurd. Others proposed inland transportation networks, moving goods by rail and road rather than by sea. But Japan's geography made this largely impossible. The country consisted of islands separated by water that had to be crossed. Rail capacity was limited and already strained. Roads could not handle heavy industrial cargo in sufficient volume. The empire's dependence on maritime transport was not a choice, but a geographic necessity. Eliminating it meant eliminating the ability to function as an industrial society. In Tokyo, the leadership faced an impossible situation. The war could not be won. This was increasingly clear to anyone willing to examine the facts honestly, but surrender remained unthinkable, a betrayal of every principle the military system was built upon. The result was drift. Meetings occurred. Plans were discussed. Orders were issued, but none of it addressed the fundamental reality. The nation was dying, and no amount of fighting spirit could change that. Ordinary citizens experienced the collapse in intimate, personal ways. A mother watching her children grow thinner each day, knowing the rations would be cut again next week. A factory worker reporting to a plant with no power, sitting idle because there was nowhere else to go and no other way to receive even minimal food distribution. A fisherman staring at his boat, knowing that taking it to sea meant probable death, but that staying in port meant certain starvation. The psychological impact was profound. For years, the population had endured hardship with the understanding that sacrifice served a greater purpose. Victory would justify the suffering. But as spring turned to summer in 1945, victory became an obvious fantasy. The Americans did not need to invade. They could simply wait. Every week that passed meant more hunger, more darkness, more dysfunction. Time was on their side absolutely. Some Japanese leaders began to understand. Quiet conversations occurred in private rooms, away from the zealots who would interpret any suggestion of surrender as treason. These men looked at charts showing shipping tonnage, food reserves, industrial output. They performed calculations and arrived at conclusions that could not be spoken aloud. The empire had months, perhaps only weeks, before complete systemic collapse. After that point, organized resistance would become impossible, not because of cowardice, but because the physical capacity to resist would cease to exist. The mining campaign, meanwhile, continued without pause. By August, the Americans had deployed over 12,000 mines in Japanese waters. The cumulative effect was a blockade more complete than any fleet could have achieved. The cost had been minimal. A few dozen aircraft lost to accidents or rare encounters with enemy fighters. a few hundred tons of specialized ordnance. In return, Japanese shipping had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-campaign levels. The economic damage exceeded that inflicted by years of strategic bombing. Cities burned in air raids could be rebuilt. Factories destroyed could be replaced. But an economy prevented from functioning could not be repaired while the conditions preventing its function remained in place. The end, when it came, arrived not from the mines alone but from the convergence of multiple catastrophes. Atomic weapons destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union entered the war, crushing Japanese forces in Manchuria. But beneath these dramatic events, the silent strangulation of Operation Starvation had already made continued resistance impossible. The military machine had no fuel for its vehicles, no ammunition for its guns, no food for its soldiers. Civilian morale had collapsed under the weight of hunger and hopelessness. The emperor's decision to surrender, delivered in a radio address most Japanese had never heard his voice before, simply acknowledged what the mines had already accomplished. In the aftermath, historians would analyze the campaign with academic detachment, calculating tonnage sunk and economic damage inflicted. The numbers told a story of devastating efficiency. Operation Starvation had crippled Japan's economy at minimal cost, shortened the war by months, and saved countless lives that would have been lost in an invasion. The statistics were impressive and bloodless. But statistics do not capture the human experience of slow collapse. They do not describe the particular desperation of waiting in line for hours for a ration that would not sustain life. They do not quantify the moral erosion that occurs when survival requires betraying every social bond. They do not measure the psychological damage of watching a society disintegrate in slow motion, while those in power insist that nothing fundamental has changed. The mines themselves remained long after the war ended, buried in sediment, corroding slowly, occasionally still capable of detonating decades later when disturbed by dredging or construction. They served as physical reminders of a peculiar truth. Modern warfare could destroy nations without drama, without the grand battles that military culture romanticized. It required only the patient application of force against the invisible systems that made organized society possible. Japan in 1945 learned what every subsequent military power has been forced to acknowledge. An army marches on its stomach, but a modern industrial state runs on logistics. Disrupt those logistics comprehensively enough, and everything else becomes irrelevant. Fortifications mean nothing if the defenders are starving. Weapons stockpiles mean nothing if they cannot be moved to the front. Fighting spirit means nothing if the physical capacity to fight has been eliminated. The Americans had discovered something both elegant and terrible. They did not need to break the enemy's will to fight. They only needed to break the enemy's ability to sustain fighting. The mines achieved this with ruthless simplicity. Each weapon represented a tiny probability of destruction, but deployed in thousands, they created a certainty of systemic failure. Mathematics replaced heroism. Probability replaced courage. The result was inevitable. Visitors to Japanese ports in the months after surrender found scenes of eerie stillness. Harbors filled with immobilized ships, docks piled with cargo that had never been unloaded, warehouses full of goods that would never reach their destinations. The infrastructure of commerce stood intact but functionless, a monument to the fragility of complex systems. It did not require total destruction to achieve defeat. It required only sufficient disruption to prevent coordination, to break the chains of cause and effect that allowed an industrial economy to operate. The lesson was clear but uncomfortable. Wars could be won without glory, decided by clerks calculating tonnage rather than soldiers charging beaches. The mines that fell through the darkness over Japan in the spring of 1945 carried no rage, no hatred, no ideology. They were simply tools optimized for a specific function. That function was economic murder, the death of not individual humans, but of the collective organism that organized humans into nations. In the end, Operation Starvation succeeded because it attacked what the enemy could not defend. Japan could prepare for invasion. It could fortify beaches and train kamikaze pilots and mobilize its population for total war. But it could not survive without food, without fuel, without the basic materials that industrial civilization required. The mines targeted not military strength but biological necessity. Against that, no amount of courage or sacrifice mattered. The harbors fell silent. The factories went dark. The markets emptied. And in that silence and darkness and emptiness, the war ended not with an explosion but with the slow exhalation of a society that could no longer sustain the effort of breathing. The mines had done their work. They had proven that in modern war, the most devastating weapons are often the ones that kill without anyone noticing, that destroy through absence rather than presence, that defeat nations by making the ordinary impossible. So what do you think? Could Japan have survived if it had recognized the threat earlier and devoted everything to clearing the mines? Or was the geographic reality of island dependence on maritime trade always going to be an impossible vulnerability? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this story compelling, if it changed how you understand the hidden mechanics of warfare, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting that like button. History is full of these silent catastrophes, the wars won without battles, the defeats that arrived not in fire but in slow starvation. We will keep bringing them to you.